I let my husband believe I was clueless about the money, until the divorce hearing. I have always prided myself on my ability to read a room the way I once read balance sheets, line by line, number by number, searching for the story hidden beneath the surface where most people never thought to look. And on that particular Sunday evening in late September, when the air still carried the weight of summer heat but promised the relief of autumn just beyond reach, I walked into my son's beautiful four-bedroom colonial with its perfectly manicured lawn and its cheerful yellow door, and I knew, with the kind of bone-deep certainty that comes from raising a child alone and learning to trust your instincts when there's no one else to rely on, that something in this house had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. The first thing I noticed was the silence, which wasn't really silence at all but rather the absence of the particular kind of warmth that used to fill this space when I arrived for our weekly dinners. Back when Michael would bound down the stairs with Lucas perched on his shoulders and Emma would rush to show me her latest school project before I'd even removed my coat. Back when Sarah's laughter would drift from the kitchen along with the smell of whatever complicated recipe she'd decided to attempt because she knew how much I appreciated her efforts to make me feel welcome in a home that, despite being my son's, had never quite felt like mine to inhabit freely. Now there was just the mechanical hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of a television playing something with canned laughter, and the brittle quality of forced normalcy that made my shoulders tense the moment I stepped across the threshold. "Margaret, you're here." Sarah's voice came from the kitchen, pitched slightly too high, carrying that overbright cheerfulness that reminded me of the way I used to sound during those first terrible months after my husband left, when I was still pretending to the neighbors and to Michael and mostly to myself that everything was fine, that we were fine, that the sudden absence of a man who had promised forever hadn't carved a hole through the center of our lives that we'd spend years learning to walk around. I set my purse on the entryway table, the expensive one Michael and Sarah had bought at that boutique furniture store downtown, the one I'd privately thought was overpriced even as I admired its craftsmanship, and made my way toward the kitchen, cataloging details as I went the way I couldn't seem to stop myself from doing even though I'd been retired from accounting for nearly 8 years now. The family photos on the wall were slightly crooked, as if no one had bothered to straighten them after the cleaning service came through. There was a small crack in the baseboards near the living room entrance that definitely hadn't been there last month. The hardwood floors, which Sarah usually kept polished to a shine that reflected the overhead lights, looked dull and neglected, marked with scuff marks that should have been buffed out weeks ago. In the kitchen, Sarah stood at the stove stirring something that smelled like marinara sauce, her honey blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail instead of the neat bun she usually wore, her yoga pants and oversized sweater a far cry from the put-together outfits she typically favored even for casual family dinners, and when she turned to greet me with that too-wide smile, I saw the circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer had quite managed to hide, the way her collarbones protruded more sharply than they had a month ago, the slight tremor in her hands as she set down the wooden spoon and moved to embrace me. "How are you, sweetheart?" I asked, holding her just a moment longer than usual, feeling the fragility in her frame that spoke of missed meals and sleepless nights, and the kind of stress that devours you from the inside out. "Oh, busy as always," she said, pulling back and immediately turning her attention to the pot on the stove, avoiding my eyes with the practiced ease of someone who had been lying to herself for so long that the deception had become second nature. "Michael got a promotion at work. Did he tell you? He's been absolutely swamped with the new responsibilities, barely has time to breathe most days, but we're so proud of him, and the extra money will really help with Emma's activities and Lucas's preschool and everything else that seems to cost more every single year." The words tumbled out of her in a rush, filling the space between us with chatter that said nothing and everything all at once, and I recognized the pattern because I had lived it myself, this need to explain and justify and smooth over the cracks with words until maybe, if you talked long enough and fast enough, you could convince everyone including yourself that there were no cracks at all, just a perfectly intact surface that would hold indefinitely if only everyone would stop looking so closely. "Where are my grandchildren?" I asked, partly because I genuinely wanted to see Emma and Lucas and partly because I needed to give Sarah permission to stop performing this exhausting show of normalcy for my benefit. "Emma's in her room doing homework. Can you believe they give first graders homework now? When I was teaching we barely assigned anything before third grade, but apparently the standards have changed, and Lucas is watching television because honestly Margaret, I just needed 20 minutes of peace to get dinner on the table, and I know we're supposed to limit screen time but some days you just have to choose your battles, you know?" The words came faster now, tinged with defensiveness, as if she expected me to judge her for the very ordinary challenges of parenting that every mother faces and that only a fool or a saint would criticize. "Every good mother chooses her battles," I said firmly, placing my hand on her arm in a gesture that I hoped conveyed both solidarity and the unspoken message that I was not here to add to her burdens, that whatever was happening in this house, she had at least one person who would not require her to pretend. "Why don't I go say hello to them and give you a few minutes to yourself?" The relief that flashed across her face was so profound it made my chest ache with the recognition that this woman, this kind, genuine woman who had married my son and given me 2 perfect grandchildren, and who had always treated me with more warmth and respect than I probably deserved given how difficult it must be to navigate the complicated territory of mother-in-law relationships, was drowning in whatever waters had risen around her. And no one, least of all my son, was throwing her a lifeline. I found Emma in her bedroom, which was decorated in various shades of purple, and covered with the kind of creative chaos that belongs to imaginative 6-year-olds who see possibility in every scrap of paper and abandoned art supply. She was lying on her stomach on her bed, legs kicking in the air behind her, working intently on what appeared to be a worksheet about addition, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration the way Michael used to do when he was her age and struggling with his own homework at our kitchen table while I made dinner and tried to figure out how to pay the electric bill on time. "Grandma!" she squealed when she noticed me in the doorway, abandoning her worksheet immediately and launching herself off the bed with the kind of reckless confidence that children possess before the world teaches them to doubt their body's ability to catch them when they fall. I caught her easily, folding her into my arms and breathing in the smell of her strawberry shampoo and the indefinable sweetness that belongs only to children. And for just a moment everything else fell away and there was only this, the pure, uncomplicated love between a grandmother and her granddaughter, unmarred by the adult complications that were clearly unfolding in the rooms below us. "Tell me everything," I said, settling onto her bed with her tucked against my side. And she did, in the meandering way of children who haven't yet learned that adults often prefer summaries to detailed narratives, telling me about the new girl in her class who had moved from somewhere called Maine and who had never seen palm trees before, which Emma found absolutely hilarious, about the science project they were doing with plants and sunlight, about the book she was reading with her teacher, about a girl who discovered magic in her grandmother's garden. And then, in the casual way that children drop bombs into conversations without realizing they've detonated anything at all, she said, "Daddy's friend David comes over a lot now when Mommy's at work, and they always go into Daddy's office and close the door and Mommy says I'm not supposed to bother them because they're working on important business things. But one time I needed help with my math and I opened the door without knocking. I know I'm not supposed to, but I really didn't understand how to borrow from the tens place, and Daddy got really mad, like more mad than when I accidentally broke his laptop, and David just laughed, but it wasn't a nice laugh, you know? It was the kind of laugh that means someone thinks something is funny but not in a good way. Every instinct I possessed, honed over 30 years of tracking money trails and identifying discrepancies and knowing, always knowing, when the numbers didn't quite add up the way they should, fired simultaneously in a cascade of alarm bells that I forced myself to silence because I was sitting with my granddaughter in her purple bedroom and she didn't need to see the cold fury that was beginning to crystallize in my chest, didn't need to know that her innocent observation had confirmed what I had only suspected since walking through the door. "Sometimes grown-ups need privacy for boring work conversations," I said carefully, keeping my voice light even as my mind raced through possibilities and scenarios and the particular kind of important business that required closed doors and secrecy and visits during a wife's working hours. "But you know you can always come to Grandma if you need help with math, right? You can call me anytime." She nodded against my shoulder, satisfied with this answer in the way that children are satisfied when adults acknowledge their concerns without making too big a deal of them. And we sat there for another few minutes before I extracted myself with promises to help her with her homework after dinner and made my way downstairs, where Lucas had abandoned his television show in favor of crashing toy cars into each other with the kind of enthusiastic sound effects that only preschool boys can produce. I spent some time with him, building an elaborate ramp system for his cars and listening to his breathless explanations of which car was the fastest and why the red one was actually a bad guy car. But sometimes it could be good if the blue car asked it nicely, and all the while I was thinking about closed doors and friends who visited during convenient absences and the way Sarah's hands had trembled when she thought I wasn't looking. When Michael finally came downstairs, and I noted the time, noted that he'd been home for at least 30 minutes before bothering to greet his own mother, noted the way he barely glanced at his son playing on the floor. He was dressed in expensive casual clothes that I knew for a fact cost more than I used to spend on a month's worth of groceries, and he had his phone in his hand. His attention divided between the screen and the room he just entered in a way that suggested the screen was infinitely more interesting than his family. "Hey, Mom," he said absently, bending to kiss my cheek in a gesture that felt performative rather than genuine, and I caught a whiff of cologne that was too expensive, too strong, the smell of a man trying to cover something up rather than simply smell pleasant. "Michael," I said, studying his face. My son's face, the face I had wiped tears from and fussed over when he had chicken pox and watched mature from boy to man, and finding something there that I didn't quite recognize, a hardness around the eyes, a tightness around the mouth that spoke of secrets and stress and choices that were already made and couldn't be unmade no matter how much anyone might wish otherwise. Dinner was a stilted affair. Conversation forced through the machinery of polite family interaction even though the gears were grinding and the engine was clearly failing. And I watched, cataloged, assessed every moment. The way Michael checked his phone 4 times during the meal despite Sarah's increasingly pointed looks. The way he barely touched the food his wife had spent hours preparing. The way he interrupted Emma when she tried to tell him about her school day. The way he ignored Lucas entirely when the boy asked him to come play cars after dinner. I watched Sarah try to compensate for his distance by being extra animated, extra engaged, her performance so transparent it made my heart hurt for her. And I watched my grandchildren slowly withdraw into themselves as they realized, with the uncanny perception that children possess, that something was wrong even if they couldn't articulate what it was. And then, just as Sarah was serving dessert, a homemade apple pie that she must have gotten up early to bake, another offering on the altar of maintaining appearances, Michael's phone rang, and he glanced at the screen with an expression that I recognized from my years of reading people across boardroom tables and in quiet offices where money changed hands and secrets were kept. Guilt, mixed with something that looked almost like fear, and underneath it all, a desperate kind of relief at having an excuse to escape. "I have to take this," he said, already pushing back from the table, and Sarah's face did something complicated. A flash of anger quickly suppressed beneath resignation. And I knew in that moment that this was not the first time, not even the 10th time, that Michael had abandoned his family for a phone call that couldn't wait. "Michael, it's Sunday dinner," Sarah said quietly, and there was something in her voice that made me think of a person who has asked the same question so many times they no longer expect an answer but can't quite stop themselves from asking anyway. "It's work, Sarah, I can't just ignore it when we've got this deal closing," he snapped, and then he was gone, his footsteps echoing up the stairs, and I heard the distinct sound of his office door closing with more force than was strictly necessary. I helped Sarah clear the table, and when I moved to the sink to wash dishes, she had protested but I had insisted, needing something to do with my hands while my mind worked through the implications of everything I'd observed. I opened the drawer where she kept the kitchen towels, and my hand froze on a stack of envelopes that someone had shoved hastily into the drawer, clearly hoping they would be forgotten or at least unseen by visiting mothers-in-law, who had a habit of helping with cleanup. I didn't mean to look, or perhaps I did mean to look because some part of me had known since walking through that yellow door that I would find something. Had to find something to explain the wrongness that permeated this house like a gas leak you couldn't see but could sense in the way it made everything feel dangerous and unstable. The envelopes were bills, past due notices printed in aggressive red letters that shouted their urgency even in a kitchen drawer where they'd been hidden from sight. Electricity, water, the mortgage payment that was apparently 60 days overdue, and beneath them, barely visible, a credit card statement with a balance that made my breath catch in my throat because I knew with absolute certainty, that Sarah had no idea this card existed. No idea that her husband had racked up $22,000 in debt on purchases and cash advances that no legitimate business expense could justify. I closed the drawer carefully, my hand steady despite the rage that was building in my chest, and I turned back to the sink and I finished washing the dishes and I dried them and I put them away. And all the while I was thinking about balance sheets and hidden accounts and the particular kind of deception that happens not all at once but in increments, small betrayals that compound over time until suddenly you're drowning in debt and lies. And you can't remember exactly when the water started rising or why you didn't notice until it was already over your head. When I finally left that night, Michael had never returned from his phone call. Sarah had made excuses with the practiced ease of someone who had been making them for months, and the children had hugged me goodbye with a desperation that suggested they sensed I was somehow safer than the adults who were supposed to be protecting them. I sat in my car in their driveway for a long moment, staring at that cheerful yellow door and the perfect colonial facade and thinking about all the ways a house could look beautiful on the outside while rotting from within. I pulled out of the driveway and I drove home to my modest condo with its sensible furniture and its lack of pretension, and I poured myself a glass of wine and I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and a pen, and I wrote down everything I had observed that evening, every detail and discrepancy and moment of wrongness, because I had spent 30 years as an accountant and I knew that the truth always revealed itself eventually if you were patient enough and thorough enough and willing to look at what was really there instead of what you wished you would find. And as I wrote, as I documented the beginning of what I somehow knew would be a long and painful unraveling, I thought about my son, the boy I had raised alone, the man I thought I knew, and I wondered exactly when he had become someone capable of destroying his family one secret at a time, and I made a decision that would change everything. I would not confront him, I would not demand explanations, I would not give him the opportunity to create better lies or hide the evidence more carefully, because I had learned long ago that the truth matters less than proof, and proof requires patience, and I had nothing but time and a mother's determination to protect the people she loved, even if it meant becoming someone my son would never forgive. The morning of the divorce hearing dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that felt almost obscene given the circumstances, the early November sun streaming through my bedroom windows with an enthusiasm that seemed to mock the gravity of what was about to unfold in that stark courthouse downtown, where families went to be legally dismantled and where I would sit across from my son and watch him realize that his mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise him, who had worked double shifts and skipped meals and wore second-hand clothes so he could have new sneakers and school supplies and a chance at a better life than the one his father's abandonment had threatened to leave us with, had spent 14 months methodically, meticulously, ruthlessly documenting every lie he'd told and every dollar he'd stolen and every moment he'd chosen his addiction over the family he'd promised to cherish. I had helped Sarah dress that morning, had driven to her small rental house, so different from the colonial with the yellow door, which had been sold 6 months ago to pay off a fraction of Michael's debts, and found her standing in front of her closet in her bathrobe, paralyzed by the simple act of choosing what to wear to the legal dissolution of her marriage, as if the right outfit might somehow make the day less devastating or at least make her feel less vulnerable when she had to sit in that courtroom and recount every humiliation she'd endured. I had pulled out a navy blue dress that struck the right balance between respectful and confident, had made her coffee and toast that she couldn't eat, had listened to her rehearse her testimony with a trembling voice while I braided her hair with the same gentle efficiency I'd once used on Emma when she couldn't manage the tangles herself, and I had told her what I'd been telling her for months now, that she was stronger than she knew, that this pain was temporary even though it felt eternal, that on the other side of this hearing was a life where she wouldn't have to lie awake at night wondering if the electricity would be shut off or if the bank would foreclose or if her husband would come home at all. The courthouse was exactly as bleak as I'd imagined it would be, all fluorescent lights and industrial tile and the kind of institutional beige that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who entered. And as we walked through the metal detectors and made our way to the family court waiting area, I kept my hand on Sarah's elbow because I could feel her shaking and I needed her to know that she wasn't alone, that whatever happened in that courtroom, she had someone in her corner who understood exactly what was at stake and who would not let Michael's charm or his attorney's manipulations or the system's inherent bias toward keeping families together at all costs prevent the truth from being heard and acknowledged and acted upon. Michael was already there when we arrived, sitting with his attorney, a slick young man in an expensive suit who had clearly convinced my son that he could spin this situation into something other than what it was, could somehow transform theft and addiction and abandonment into a narrative where Michael was the victim of a vindictive wife and an overreaching mother-in-law. And when Michael saw me, when our eyes met across that waiting area with its uncomfortable plastic chairs and its outdated magazines and its atmosphere of collective misery, I saw something flicker across his face that might have been shame or might have been anger or might have been the terrible realization that the game he'd been playing had rules he'd never bothered to learn and opponents he'd catastrophically underestimated. He looked terrible, I noticed with the particular clarity that comes from loving someone and hating what they've become, his expensive clothes hanging off a frame that had lost at least 20 pounds, his eyes shadowed with the kind of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep but from the soul-deep weariness of maintaining lies that have grown too heavy to carry, and for just a moment I felt a surge of maternal instinct so powerful it nearly knocked me sideways, this primal urge to gather him into my arms and fix whatever had broken inside him and protect him from the consequences of his own choices. But I pushed it down, buried it beneath the weight of all those nights I'd spent helping Sarah figure out how to feed her children when the grocery money had disappeared into Michael's addiction. All those times I'd held Emma while she cried because Daddy had missed another recital. All those moments I'd watched Lucas's face fall when his father walked past him without acknowledgement, too consumed by whatever fresh disaster was unfolding on his phone to notice his son's desperate bid for attention. The hearing itself was everything I'd anticipated and worse, a parade of financial records and testimony that laid bare the complete decimation of a family's security and trust, and I sat in the gallery beside my sister, who had taken time off work to be there for moral support and to watch her nephew face consequences that were 14 months overdue. And I listened to Sarah's attorney methodically dismantle Michael's version of events with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor, presenting bank statements that showed systematic withdrawals and transfers, credit card bills for cash advances that could only have gone to gambling debts, loan applications where Michael had forged Sarah's signature to secure money that he'd then immediately lost at poker tables and online betting sites that operated in legal gray areas designed specifically to prey on people exactly like my son. Michael's attorney tried valiantly to paint this as a story of addiction and illness, to frame my son as someone who deserved compassion rather than punishment, who needed treatment rather than judgment, and while I couldn't entirely disagree with the premise, addiction is an illness and Michael did need help, I also knew that illness doesn't excuse devastation, that you can acknowledge someone's suffering while still holding them accountable for the suffering they've caused others, and that my son had been offered help, had been given countless opportunities to come clean and seek treatment and rebuild trust, and he had chosen instead to double down on his lies, to gaslight his wife into questioning her own sanity, to steal from the college funds he and Sarah had established for their children, to risk everything and everyone for the temporary high of believing the next hand would be the one that fixed everything. And then Sarah's attorney called my name, and I stood and made my way to the witness stand with my leather portfolio tucked under my arm, containing 14 months of documentation that represented countless hours of observation and research and the kind of patient, methodical work that had defined my career, and that I'd never imagined I would have to deploy against my own child. And as I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, I felt the full weight of what I was about to do settle over me like a mantle I'd never asked for but couldn't refuse to wear. I introduced myself not as Margaret Chun, concerned mother and grandmother, but as Margaret Chun, former forensic accountant with 30 years of experience tracking financial irregularities and fraud, and I watched the judge's expression shift from polite attention to sharp interest because he understood, as Michael's attorney was just beginning to understand with dawning horror, that this was not going to be emotional testimony from a worried family member, but rather expert analysis from someone who knew exactly how to read financial records and exactly what story those records were telling. I walked them through it chronologically, starting with that first Sunday dinner when I'd noticed the wrongness that permeated my son's beautiful house, the past due bills hidden in kitchen drawers, the expensive gifts that didn't align with claims of financial hardship, and I presented my notebook with its meticulous entries, each observation dated and detailed and cross-referenced with supporting documentation that I'd gathered through entirely legal means, public records information Sarah had provided with proper authorization, photographs taken in contexts where there was no expectation of privacy, and I watched Michael's face cycle through disbelief and betrayal and finally a kind of hollow resignation as he realized that his mother, the woman he'd apparently assumed was too old or too trusting or too blinded by maternal love to see what he was doing, had been building an airtight case against him since the moment she'd suspected something was wrong. I presented the private investigator's report, complete with time-stamped photographs of Michael entering casinos, meeting with known gambling associates, withdrawing maximum daily limits from ATMs in patterns that suggested desperation rather than recreational betting, and I explained in the calm, professional tone I'd perfected over decades of presenting findings to skeptical executives and resistant board members that this wasn't just a case of a man who'd made some mistakes with money but rather a systematic pattern of deception and financial abuse that had placed his wife and children in genuine jeopardy, had destroyed their credit, had cost them their home, had stolen their sense of security and replaced it with the kind of pervasive anxiety that corrodes everything it touches. Michael's attorney tried to discredit me during cross-examination, suggesting that my testimony was biased, that a mother shouldn't testify against her son, that my involvement represented some kind of boundary violation or revenge for perceived slights, And I looked at him with the same level gaze I'd once used on corporate lawyers trying to intimidate me during depositions, and I said, in a voice that carried clearly through that hushed courtroom, that being Michael's mother didn't give him immunity from consequences, that love without accountability wasn't love at all but rather enabling, that I had raised my son to be honest and responsible, and when he'd failed to live up to those values I'd had a choice to make between protecting him from discomfort or protecting his wife and children from genuine harm. And I'd chosen the people who were most vulnerable because that's what love actually requires, not blind loyalty but rather the courage to do what's right even when it costs you everything. Mrs. Chun, the attorney said, and I could hear the frustration in his voice because he'd clearly expected me to crumble under questioning or at least show some uncertainty about my decision to testify. You're asking this court to believe that you spent over a year secretly investigating your own son, gathering evidence against him, helping his wife prepare for divorce, all while maintaining the pretense of a normal family relationship. Doesn't that strike you as manipulative, as a profound betrayal of the trust that should exist between a mother and son? And I looked at him, and then I looked at Michael, and I let him see everything I'd been feeling for the past 14 months, all the heartbreak and disappointment and lingering love that made this hurt so much more than it would have if I didn't care, and I said, what strikes me as a profound betrayal is watching someone you love destroy themselves and everyone around them while refusing every offer of help, every opportunity for honesty, every chance to step back from the edge before the fall becomes fatal. And the manipulation wasn't in my documentation of what was happening but in Michael's deliberate campaign to make his wife believe she was crazy, paranoid, incompetent, when she was simply responding rationally to a situation that was genuinely catastrophic. So no, counselor, I don't regret what I did, because someone needed to tell the truth and Michael had demonstrated repeatedly that it wouldn't be him. The courtroom was silent after that, the kind of silence that feels heavy and significant, and I saw Michael drop his head into his hands, saw his shoulders shake with what might have been sobs or might have been laughter at the absurdity of being so thoroughly undone by the woman who'd given him life, and I felt a complex tangle of emotions that I couldn't quite name, grief and vindication and exhaustion and a strange kind of relief that the performance was finally over, that we could all stop pretending and start dealing with what actually was rather than maintaining the fiction of what we'd wanted things to be. The judge ruled swiftly and decisively after closing arguments, granting Sarah primary custody with Michael's visitation contingent on completion of gambling addiction treatment, ordering substantial child support and the division of assets that heavily favored Sarah given Michael's role in their dissipation, mandating that Michael attend therapy and 12-step meetings and provide regular proof of compliance. And as the judge spoke, I watched my son's carefully constructed world crumble around him with the inevitability of a building that had been structurally unsound from the beginning, and was only now revealing the extent of its instability. During the recess before finalizing paperwork, Michael found me in the courthouse hallway, and for a moment we just stood there looking at each other, mother and son, separated by circumstances that seemed insurmountable and connected by bonds that neither time nor betrayal could completely sever. And when he finally spoke, his voice was raw with emotion and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "How could you do this to me?" he asked, and I heard the genuine bewilderment beneath the anger, as if he truly couldn't comprehend how the mother who'd always protected him, always advocated for him, always seen the best in him even when he'd given her every reason not to, could have turned on him so completely. "I didn't do this to you, Michael," I said quietly, aware that we were in a public space but unable to stop the words that had been building for months from finally spilling out. "You did this to yourself, and you did it to Sarah, and you did it to Emma and Lucas, and what I did was make sure that the people you hurt had someone documenting the truth because you'd proven that you couldn't be trusted to tell it. And I understand that you feel betrayed, but what you need to understand is that I would have helped you, would have done anything to support you if you'd been honest, if you'd admitted you had a problem and asked for help before you'd gambled away your children's security and your wife's trust, and any chance of salvaging this without the courts getting involved. I have a problem, I'm sick, I couldn't stop," he said, and there was desperation in his voice, a plea for understanding that I recognized because I'd heard it before in my own voice during those dark months after his father left, when I'd made excuses for a man who'd chosen to abandon his responsibilities, and I tried to convince myself and everyone else that there were reasonable explanations for the unreasonable devastation he'd left in his wake. "Then you should have gotten help," I said, and I let him hear the steel beneath the sadness because he needed to understand that compassion and consequences weren't mutually exclusive. You had a year, Michael, a full year during which I watched you lie to your wife and ignore your children and drain every account you could access. And at any point during that year you could have come to me, could have gone to Sarah, could have walked into a therapist's office or a GA meeting or anywhere that might have helped you stop the spiral. But instead you chose to protect your addiction over your family, and that's the choice you have to live with now. He looked at me then with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, something raw and broken and finally honest, without the layers of deflection and justification that he'd been hiding behind for so long, and he said, "I'm sorry, Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know how to stop and I didn't want you to know what I'd become and I thought I could fix it myself if I just had one more chance, one more win. And by the time I realized I couldn't fix it, the hole was so deep I couldn't see any way out except to keep digging, and hope I'd somehow tunnel through to the other side." And I did something then that surprised both of us. I reached out and pulled him into an embrace, feeling how thin he'd become, how fragile, and I held him the way I'd held him when he was small and the world had hurt him and he'd needed to know that someone loved him unconditionally, and I said into his hair, "I still love you, Michael. I will always love you because you're my son and that doesn't change no matter what you've done, but loving you doesn't mean protecting you from the consequences of your choices. It means standing beside you while you face those consequences and rebuild yourself into someone who deserves the trust you've destroyed. And I will be here for that process if you're genuinely ready to do the work. But I won't enable you or lie for you or help you avoid the reality of what you've done, because that's not love, that's just fear, and I refuse to parent from fear anymore." We stood there in that courthouse hallway for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, and when we finally pulled apart there was something different in his eyes, a clarity that hadn't been there before, as if hitting rock bottom in such a public and definitive way had finally broken through whatever delusions he'd been maintaining about his ability to manage his addiction alone. And he nodded slowly and said, "I don't know if I can ever make this right, but I want to try. I need to. Try not for you or for Sarah but for Emma and Lucas, because they deserve better than the father I've been." "Then start trying," I said simply, because there was nothing else to say, no words that could undo the damage or fast forward through the long, painful process of rebuilding trust and sobriety, and a relationship with his children that had been fractured by his extended absence even when he'd been physically present. 6 months later, I found myself back in Sarah's kitchen. Her new kitchen, smaller and more modest than the one in the house with the yellow door but filled with a warmth and lightness that had been absent from that expensive suburban showcase. Helping Emma and Lucas make cookies while Sarah graded papers at the kitchen table and Michael, who'd completed his court-mandated treatment and was working a second job to pay child support and restitution, sat on the floor building an elaborate tower. With Lucas, his movements careful and present in a way they hadn't been for years, as if he'd finally learned that being a father required showing up not just physically but emotionally, consistently, without the distraction of whatever crisis or opportunity was beckoning from his phone. Sunday dinners had resumed, but they were different now, stripped of pretense and performance and the exhausting effort of maintaining appearances, and there was something almost sacred in the honesty that infused these gatherings, the way Michael could admit when he was struggling without shame, the way Sarah could set boundaries without guilt, the way Emma and Lucas could be children without the burden of sensing and trying to fix the adult dysfunction that had once poisoned every family interaction. Michael and Sarah would never reconcile romantically. Too much had been broken, too much trust had been shattered. But they'd found a way to co-parent that prioritized their children's well-being over their own hurt and anger. And I'd found a way to love my son while acknowledging the pain he'd caused and holding space for the possibility that people could change without erasing the memory of who they'd been at their worst. That evening, after Emma and Lucas had been tucked into bed and Sarah had retreated to her room to finish her grading and Michael had driven back to his studio apartment with promises to call me during the week, I sat alone in my own kitchen with a cup of tea and the notebook that had started this whole journey, the meticulous documentation of my son's unraveling that I'd never shown him in its entirety because some truths were too painful to revisit in detail, and I thought about the cost of honesty, the way it demands everything from you and offers no guarantees that the sacrifice will be worth it. I thought about the version of myself who had walked into that colonial house 14 months ago, who had seen the wrongness and made the choice to investigate rather than confront, to document rather than demand, to build a case rather than stage an intervention. And I wondered if I would make the same choice again, knowing what I knew now about the pain that truth-telling exacts from everyone involved, and I realized that I would, that I absolutely would, because the alternative, allowing Sarah and my grandchildren to continue drowning in Michael's addiction while I maintained the comfortable fiction that everything was fine, was unconscionable, was the opposite of love no matter how much easier it might have been in the short term. They had called me ruthless in the courthouse that day, and perhaps I was. Perhaps there was something cold and calculating in the way I'd systematically gathered evidence against my own child, but I'd learned long ago that sometimes love requires ruthlessness, that protecting the vulnerable sometimes means becoming the villain in someone else's story, that doing the right thing rarely feels good in the moment even when you know with absolute certainty that it's necessary. I closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer where I kept important documents, a reminder of everything we'd survived and everything we'd lost and everything we were still learning to rebuild from the rubble. And I thought about my mother, who died when I was too young to really know her but who'd left me with a single piece of advice that I'd carried through every difficult decision of my life, that the truth might hurt but lies destroy, that temporary pain is preferable to permanent damage, that you could survive almost anything except the slow erosion of your own integrity. And sitting there in my quiet kitchen with the evening light fading through the windows and the sound of the city settling into its nighttime rhythms beyond my walls, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Peace, not the peace of resolution or redemption because those things take years and might never come completely, but the peace of knowing I'd done what needed to be done, of having looked at an impossible situation and chosen the hard right over the easy wrong, of having loved my family enough to risk their hatred in service of their salvation. I let Michael believe I was clueless about the money, about the gambling, about the lies, about the systematic destruction of everything he'd built, until the moment in that courtroom when the truth could no longer be avoided or explained away or smoothed over with charm and promises, and in the wake of that revelation we'd all had to learn how to exist in a new reality where honesty was the baseline rather than the exception, where accountability was expected rather than optional, where love meant showing up even when it was hard rather than disappearing when it became inconvenient. And if given the choice between comfortable delusion and painful truth, between protecting my son from consequences and protecting his family from devastation, between maintaining peace and demanding justice, I would make the same choice every single time, would document every lie and present every piece of evidence and sit on that witness stand and tell the truth even knowing it would shatter my son's world, because that's what real love requires. Not the pretty, easy version we see in movies and greeting cards, but the brutal, uncompromising version that demands you sacrifice your own comfort for someone else's well-being, that asks you to be strong enough to let people face the results of their choices, even when every instinct you possess screams at you to intervene and protect and smooth things over one more time. I would do it all again, and that certainty, that bone-deep knowing that I'd chosen correctly even when the choice had cost me everything, was the only absolution I needed. The only peace I could claim in the wreckage of a family that had been broken by lies and was being slowly, painfully rebuilt on a foundation of truth that was solid enough to bear the weight of whatever came next. The thing about truth I had come to understand in the 3 years since that November morning in the courthouse when I'd watched my son's carefully constructed lies crumble into dust and ash, is that it doesn't actually set you free in the way that popular wisdom suggests. At least not immediately, not cleanly, not without first dragging you through a kind of purgatory where freedom and imprisonment feel indistinguishable from each other, and where you question every single decision that brought you to this particular moment of reckoning. But it does eventually, after enough time has passed and enough healing has occurred and enough work has been done by everyone involved, create the possibility of a kind of freedom that's more durable and more authentic than anything built on the shifting sands of deception and willful ignorance. I was thinking about this on a Saturday morning in early spring, standing in Sarah's backyard, her new backyard, because she'd saved enough money over the past 2 years to purchase a small house with a proper yard where Emma and Lucas could play without the constraints of the rental's postage stamp lawn. Watching my son teach Lucas how to ride a bicycle without training wheels, Michael's hands steady on the seat as he ran alongside his now 7-year-old son, his voice patient and encouraging in a way that would have seemed impossible during those dark months when his addiction had rendered him incapable of noticing his children at all, let alone participating in the small but significant rituals of their growing up. Emma was sitting beside me at the patio table, her legs swinging beneath the chair as she worked on an elaborate friendship bracelet, her tongue poking out in concentration the way it always did when she was focused on something intricate and important, and every so often she would glance up to watch her brother's progress and call out encouragement or advice, and I marveled at how resilient children could be when given the space and support to process their trauma rather than being forced to pretend it hadn't happened, How Emma had gone from being an anxious, withdrawn 6-year-old who'd absorbed every ounce of tension in her parents' failing marriage to being this confident, emotionally articulate 9-year-old who could talk about her feelings and set boundaries and exist in the messiness of her family's reconstruction without being consumed by it. Michael had been sober for 32 months now. I knew because he'd called me the morning of his 2-year anniversary, his voice thick with emotion as he thanked me for refusing to enable him, for loving him enough to let him hit bottom, for being there on the other side when he'd finally been ready to climb out of the hole he'd dug. And the difference was remarkable not just in his physical appearance, though he'd regained the weight he'd lost and looked healthier than he had in years, but in his entire demeanor, the way he moved through the world with a humility and presence that suggested he'd finally understood that recovery wasn't about returning to who he'd been before the addiction but rather becoming someone entirely new, someone who'd been broken and reassembled and was stronger for having been shattered. He still attended his GA meetings twice a week, still saw his therapist every Thursday afternoon, still worked his second job on weekends even though he'd been promoted at his primary job and could technically afford to quit, because as he'd explained to me during one of our weekly coffee dates that had become a cherished ritual for both of us, he needed the reminder of what his addiction had cost, needed to feel the weight of his restitution payments and child support and the rebuilding of Emma and Lucas's college funds that he'd decimated, needed to know that redemption wasn't a destination you arrived at, but rather a direction you traveled in for the rest of your life. Sarah had started dating someone, a kind, steady man who taught at her school and who'd waited patiently for 2 years while she sorted through her divorce trauma and her trust issues and her completely understandable reluctance to risk her heart again. And I'd met him twice now, had subjected him to the kind of gentle but thorough interrogation that was my prerogative as the grandmother of the children who would eventually be introduced into his life if this relationship continued, and I'd been impressed by his emotional intelligence, his respect for Sarah's boundaries, his complete absence of flash or pretense, all the qualities that made him the opposite of the man my son had been during his addiction and exactly the kind of partner Sarah deserved after everything she'd endured. Michael had met him too, at a school event where their presence had been unavoidable, and I'd watched my son shake this other man's hand and make polite conversation, and then later, in the parking lot when it was just the two of us, I'd watched him sit in his car with his head bowed and his shoulders shaking, grieving not for the loss of Sarah. He'd long since accepted that their marriage was irrevocably over, and had even expressed relief that she'd found someone who could give her the stability and presence he'd failed to provide. But for the loss of the life he might have had if he'd made different choices, if he'd gotten help sooner, if he'd been honest instead of deceptive, if he'd prioritized his family over his addiction before the damage had become irreparable. I had held him while he cried that day, this grown man who was still my child no matter how old he got or how much he'd disappointed me, and I'd told him what I'd been telling him for 3 years now in various forms and contexts, that he couldn't change the past but he could influence the future, that his children were watching him rebuild himself and learning from his example that falling down didn't have to be fatal as long as you were willing to get back up and do the work, that regret was only useful if it motivated change rather than paralyzed you with shame, and that I was proud of him not for being perfect. Perfection was an illusion that had never served anyone well, but for being honest about his imperfection and fighting every single day to be better than he'd been the day before. The bicycle wobbled dangerously and then steadied, and suddenly Lucas was pedaling on his own. His face split into a grin of pure joy as he realized he was doing it. He was actually riding without training wheels, and Michael let go and stepped back and watched his son ride in increasingly confident circles around the yard, and the expression on my son's face, pride and love and a kind of bittersweet awareness that he'd missed so many of these moments during the years when he'd been physically present but emotionally absent, made my throat tighten with a complex mixture of emotions that I'd learned to sit with rather than push away. Grandma, do you think Dad is really better now? Or is he just pretending to be better until everyone stops watching so closely? Emma asked suddenly, her voice matter-of-fact in the way that children's voices can be when asking devastating questions, and I looked at this perceptive, brilliant child who'd been forced to grow up too fast and learn too young that the adults in her life were fallible and capable of causing tremendous harm even when they loved you, and I considered how to answer with the honesty she deserved while still being age-appropriate, and not undermining the fragile trust she was rebuilding with her father. I think your dad is really working very hard to be better, and that work is something he'll have to keep doing for the rest of his life, not just until people stop watching, I said carefully, setting down my coffee cup so I could give her my full attention. But I also think it's okay for you to be uncertain, to take your time deciding whether you trust that the changes are permanent, because trust isn't something anyone is entitled to just because they apologize or because enough time has passed. Trust has to be earned and earned again and earned some more, especially when it's been broken as badly as your dad broke it. And you get to decide at your own pace whether he's done enough earning for you to feel safe giving him another chance. She nodded slowly, absorbing this, and then she said, I'm glad you told the truth about the money even though it made Dad really sad and really angry, because if you hadn't told the truth we might still be living in that house where Mom cried all the time and Dad was always on his phone and everything felt scary even though no one would tell me why. And this house is smaller but it feels safer, you know? Like maybe bad things could still happen, but at least now people would tell me the truth about them instead of pretending everything was fine when it obviously wasn't. And in that moment, listening to my granddaughter articulate with stunning clarity why truth-telling mattered even when it hurt, even when it destroyed the comfortable fictions we'd all been maintaining, even when it cost everyone involved more than they'd ever wanted to pay, I felt a validation that I hadn't known I needed, a sense that all the sleepless nights and moral wrestling and fear that I'd made the wrong choice had been worth it because at least one person understood, at least one person could see that sometimes love requires destruction before it can enable reconstruction, that sometimes you have to burn down the house to save the people living in it. I'm glad too, sweetheart, I said, reaching over to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. And I'm proud of you for being so honest about your feelings, for not pretending everything is okay before you're ready, for taking care of yourself even when it might be easier to just go along with what everyone else wants. Lucas came pedaling over then, breathless and triumphant, demanding that everyone watch him ride in figure eights, and Michael followed behind looking more at peace than I'd seen him in years, and Sarah emerged from the kitchen carrying a pitcher of lemonade, and wearing an expression of contentment that would have seemed unimaginable 3 years ago when she'd been drowning in debt and gaslighting, and the slowly dawning realization that her marriage was built on lies, and we all settled into the rhythm of an ordinary Saturday afternoon, unremarkable in its pleasantness, extraordinary in its hard-won stability. Later, after Michael had left to go to his evening GA meeting and Sarah had taken the kids to a birthday party, and I was alone in my car driving back to my condo through streets made golden by the late afternoon sun, I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years ago, standing in that kitchen finding past due bills and making the decision to investigate rather than confront, to document rather than demand, and I wondered what I would say to her if I could reach back through time and offer some kind of reassurance or warning or wisdom. I would tell her that she was about to embark on the most difficult thing she'd ever done, that there would be nights when she questioned everything, when the weight of what she was doing would feel unbearable, when she would lie awake wondering if she was destroying her relationship with her son beyond any possibility of repair, and I would tell her that those doubts were valid and important and should be honored rather than suppressed, because anyone who does what she was about to do without doubt is someone who's lost touch with their humanity. But I would also tell her that on the other side of that courthouse hearing, beyond the immediate devastation and anger and feeling of betrayal that would radiate from her son like heat from a fire, there would be something unexpected. The possibility of real relationship rather than performed relationship, of honest connection rather than the exhausting maintenance of comfortable illusions, of a family that was smaller and more fractured than the one she'd imagined but also more authentic and more capable of weathering future storms because it had been rebuilt on a foundation of truth, rather than the quicksand of deception. I would tell her that her son would hate her for a while, not actively, not with violence or cruelty, but with the kind of cold distance that feels like a death of its own, and that she would have to sit with that hatred and not let it change her course, and that eventually, slowly, in increments so small she'd barely notice them accumulating, that hatred would transform into something more complicated. Resentment mixed with grudging respect, anger mixed with appreciation, hurt mixed with understanding until one day he would call her and thank her, and she would realize that they'd found their way back to each other not despite what she'd done but because of it.